Part 2. The British fleet was driven off at Fort McHenry near Baltimore. Baltimore had been a center for U.S. privateers. The attacking British army was also forced to withdraw. Francis Scott Key, watching the bombardment of Baltimore as a prisoner aboard a British ship, composed the Star-Spangled Banner. Jackson had been victorious in the Southwest and at New Orleans, which sparked him to national fame. The British strategy, in addition to Canada and the Atlantic coast, was to take the U.S. Gulf Coast and New Orleans. The Mississippi Creek Indians, a faction known as the Red Sticks, launched a preliminary campaign by attacking Fort Mill. 400 Americans were killed. General Andrew Jackson retaliated by attacking a Creek village and killing 300 of its warriors in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. This was the largest Indian massacre in U.S. history. A British naval force of 47 ships defeated an American force of 5 ships in the naval battle preceding the Battle of New Orleans. The significance of this major engagement was that this had bought time for Jackson's 7,000-man army to fortify New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans. The British blundered by launching a full frontal assault in January of 1850. Jackson commanded a 7,000-man army, a force of sailors, regulars, pirates, Frenchmen, free blacks, and militiamen. Over 2,000 British were killed or wounded in a half hour, compared to only about 70 Americans. Ironically, the battle was needless. The Treaty of Ghent, which had ended the War of 1812, had been signed 2 weeks earlier, but the two armies didn't get word until after the battle. A British victory in the battle most likely would have resulted in Britain changing the terms of the treaty to the detriment of the U.S. The Battle of New Orleans resulted in tremendous upsurge of American pride and nationalism. Jackson became the hero of the West, which would allow him to become elected president 13 years later. Most Americans believed New Orleans' campaign had won the war. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1814, although it was essentially an armistice. Both sides agreed to stop fighting and to restore conquered territory. However, there was no mention of pre-war U.S. grievances, impressment, the Indian menace, the orders in council, search and seizure, and confiscation. Americans retained the right to fish off the Canadian coast, however. With the Treaty of Ghent signed, Americans rejoiced, although many expected to lose territory. The Hartford Convention. New England Federalists and some Republicans adamantly opposed the war. They almost succeeded in defeating Madison in the presidential election of 1812. As the war dragged on, New England extremists became more vocal. At the Hartford Convention, December 15th in 1814, it was attended by Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont. The purpose was to discuss their grievances and seek redress for their wrongs. The immediate goal was to secure financial assistance from Washington due to the British blockading menace on New England shores. A minority of radical delegates urged secession. They were outvoted by moderate Federalists, however. The convention recommended amendments to the Constitution. They sought to end the Three-Fifths Compromise to reduce Southern influence in the House. They also wanted a required 2/3 vote for an embargo, admission of Western states to the Union, and a declaration of war. It also sought to limit the term of the president to avoid a Jeffersonian dynasty. They also sought to deny naturalized citizens the right to hold office. A trio of envoys from Massachusetts traveled to Washington with the Hartford demands. On their way, the Battle of New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent, however, made their pleas invalid. The Hartford resolutions, as a result, spelled the end of the Federalist Party. In the election of 1816, James Monroe crushed his Federalist opponent. Their acts were treated as treason, and this hurt the Federalist cause. The War of 1812 revived intense American hatred of the British and created mutual suspicion that would last for decades. Canadian patriotism and nationalism were boosted. Some say the birth of the Canadian nation was a result. Naval arms race between the U.S. and Britain began in the Great Lakes region as well. The Resch-Pagot Treaty of 1817 severely limited naval armament on the lakes. By 1870, the U.S. and Canada shared the longest unfortified border in the world. Americans were no longer worried of European intervention in North America. The War of 1812 created a new sense of nationality, and now turned their attitudes and eyes towards the settlement of the West. Thanks.